Lord, thank you for another opportunity for us all to gather today, and thank you that we live in a country where we can do this, Lord, and that thank you for getting us all here safely, Lord. I just pray for anyone else that's on the way here that you'd be with them and keep them safe on the way here, and anybody that's decided not to come today, Lord, that you'd still work in their lives and you'd still let them see you somewhere else, Lord. I just pray that as we go through Genesis chapter 23 today, Lord, that you would speak to us all and that we'd all come out with something useful, and that we could we just see your love, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen.
So the man I was holding the midrash this last week,
Mm-hmm.
saying when the original man that saying
Really? Okay, so I guess we'll be in Genesis chapter 23 today, guys. And to this point, this is probably the most difficult chapter for me to teach because it, for the most part, is pretty straightforward in the way it is. So if anyone at any point has anything that they think would be beneficial to the conversation, throw it in there, and then we'll do our best to just learn everything through here. Genesis chapter 23, verse 1. Sarah lived 127 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah. So Sarah died in Kirjath Arba, that is in Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. Then Abraham stood up from before his dead and spoke to the sons of Heth, saying, I am a foreigner and a visitor among you. Give me property for a burial place among you, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. And the sons of Heth answered Abraham, saying to him, Hear us, my lord, you are a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our burial places. None of us will withhold from you his burial place, that you may bury your dead. Then Abraham stood up and bowed himself to the people of the land, the sons of Heth. So here in the first couple of verses, we'll start there and we'll continue going on through there. So as I was going through studying this, one thing that several of the commentators brought up was this is a very rare occurrence, and it might be the only occurrence where a woman is mentioned the age when she dies. So you can go through the whole Bible. All over is the place, all over in the Bible, there's places where it mentions the age of when men die, but this is one of the few places, if not the only place, where it mentions a woman. And so I think that's really interesting because it definitely shows the importance of Sarah in the beginning building up of God's people, right? And then it says in verse 2 that she died, and then it says Abraham came to mourn for Sarah. So I thought that was an interesting thing there. Abraham always seemed to be out and doing something, if it was important or wasn't important. So it looks to me that as this happened, he had to come back. He must have heard from a messenger at some point, and he came to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. So I think this is a really important lesson here because everyone dies. We're all set to. We all have a time limit, right? God's put that. We learned about that earlier in Genesis, that it was about 120 years. One thing to point out, though, is at this point, Sarah was 127 years of age, and Abraham was about 10-ish years older. So this exceeds the 120-year number, which I think is something of importance there. And it's really interesting because even Abraham knowing and talking to God, right? He obviously knows that we all have an age limit here, but even Abraham, who would talk to God and sees his miracles happening face to face on a regular basis, even he's mourning, right? It kind of shows that he can be humbled in some ways at times too, right? And so, as we're going through life and we have a situation that may be unfortunate, may not be, right? I guess it kind of depends on the way you look at it. I've been to several funerals in my life, and only a couple of them have been like a celebration of life, right? And that is one of the privileges we have as believers, is we know that if you have trusted in God and you have given your faith to him, that you don't have to worry about it, right? Abraham, he would have known this because of his faith and his trust in the Lord. And it's okay to still be sad at times. But then we see right here, back in verse 3 with that, it says, Abraham stood up from before his dead and spoke to the sons of Heth, saying, I am a foreigner and a visitor among you. So at some point, Abraham goes, okay, it's time to get back up, right? We got to get back to work. We've got things to do here. And I think this is really interesting because when you look back towards in the Gospels, there's miracles where it comes through, where Jesus comes through and he says, why are you crying? Why are you mourning? She's just sleeping, right? And I don't remember exactly where that's at, but I think that's interesting because back to what I was saying a second ago, in a world without hope and comfort, we have hope and comfort that a lot of people don't. And I think that's something important to keep in mind because several months ago, I was actually back there. I was getting the kitchen all set up before everybody else came in. And I was sitting there and I go, this is a huge blessing that I have. That I know that, my family, my immediate family and myself, we have given our life to Christ. We have that relationship with Him. But there's a lot of people in this world that might think they have it, or they might be confused, or they just outright don't have that comfort. And I think that's something to keep in mind because as we're going through our daily life, that is something we should be keeping in mind because we can be that hope, we can be that comfort to the people of this world. And as we're living, right, we're always talking about being that light in this dark world or being the salt, right? I think it's important to think about how often are you not being the salt or the light? And when you start putting that in context with the lives that we could save by just being joyful or comforting or calming, that could be a large number, right? It's always said, like, you should know them by their fruits. Well, if we're just living and we just, Isaac and I had this great conversation last night where we're talking, yes, we're saved, yes, other people can be saved, but if we're acting just like everybody else, the jokes or the stuff we're talking about, how can other people know? And I don't remember exactly where I heard it. I heard this years ago, and it could have been at VBS or something, and it could have been Dean talking about it. But the idea was, if the communists came to the United States right now, and they started rounding people up, would you be the one in jail, or would they let you go? And the story there being, is there enough evidence to convict you? Right? And I think that's something to keep in mind here because, Abraham gets up, and as we see here in a minute, he has respect or fear in ways. But him living his life as he has up to this point and going forward, we can take that as an example as well. So right here in verse 3, Abraham gets back up. He starts talking to the sons of Heth, saying, I'm a foreigner and a visitor among you. Give me property for a burial place among you, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. And the sons of Heth answered Abraham, saying, Hear us, my lord, you are a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our burial places. None of us will withhold from his burial place, that you may bury your dead. So he gets up, he starts talking to him, and I think this is really interesting because it says, they're basically saying, hey, we don't care where you bury her, right? You can choose any spot you want. And I think this starts building up the story we're going through, right? And so, it says there, though, that he's a foreigner, a visitor to their land, right? God tells him, you're going to travel all the way to Canaan. This is going to be the land of milk and honey. This is your land. But to everybody else, they've already been living here, right? But Abraham knows that this is important. This is what God says. But he had to have they either feared him completely or he had to build their respect up at a certain point. And I think this right here is a little bit of both because they're basically saying, you can choose wherever you want. You're a mighty prince among us. They acknowledge that there's something going for them, right? And think about the lives that, like we've talked about in the past where Noah would have most likely been preaching before the ark. Abraham is most likely preaching, just living his daily life to these people. And he's built up this relationship between these other princes, these other lords of the land, right? And Kelly and I were talking about this earlier. I gave him a call. I was a bit confused. And we were talking about back to like the agriculture side of this, right? Right? They would have all had land masses here. But a lot of these people were travelers. They just kind of moved back and forth, right? So, yes, there was deeded land. Yes, this is by property. But he's saying here, I'm just a visitor. I just came out of another land. It's not like he's going to travel all the way back to bury Sarah. So I think that's something important too, is not only has he known that God's given him this land, he's also saying that he's putting his trust, saying, we're not going to travel back to where we came from. We're going to continue forward. I think that's an important thing right there. And then it says, verse 7, Abraham stood up and bowed himself to the people of land, the sons of Heth. I think that's important because he's showing that he can be humble here, right? I mean, he definitely has the resume of a warrior, a king, a prince up to this point. But he's saying, hey, this is a hard time in my life. We already seen that he was mourning, but he's being humble in the ways and showing them respect as well. Because the fact that they said you can have any spot you want here shows that they had a certain amount of respect for him. And that's important for us too, to show respect to the other unbelievers as well, right? Because there's nothing worse than, well, I went to this church when I was younger, and I can't do it anymore. These people are mean to me, right? You hear that story all the time, and it's important to keep in the back of our heads that we have to show others respect in a certain amount of way as well. And if we don't show respect, we could be the reason they leave, right? If that be from a church, or if that be, those dirty Christians out there, right? We don't want to give them a reason to say that. So Abraham here he's showing a bit of respect in verse 7. And verse 8 it goes on and says, and he spoke with them saying, if it is your wish that I bury my dead out of my sight, hear me and meet me with Ephron, the son of Zohar, for me. I think that's interesting too, because I forgot to mention that a second ago. But for whatever reason, he wants it out of his sight, right? And I don't know if that was just he wanted to give her a proper burial, or if he kind of wanted to remember the good times instead of sitting here being sad that she's no longer with him. And I don't really know about that too much, but I thought that was interesting to point out, is that he wanted to put her out of her sight. Verse 9 continues that he may, we'll go back to verse 8. And he spoke to them saying, if it is your wish that I bury my dead out of the sight here, and meet me with Ephron, the son of Zohar, for me, that he may give me the cave of Machpelah, which he has, which is at the end of the field. Let him give it to me at the full price as a property for burial place among you. Verse 10, now Ephron dwelt among the sons of Heth, and Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham in the presence of the sons of Heth, all who entered at the gate of his city, saying, no, my lord, hear me. I give you the field and the cave that is in it. I give it to you in the presence of the sons of my people. I give it to you. Bury your dead. So I think this is interesting because after they say you can choose any spot you want, he comes back and he's already kind of mapped the area out, right? He's kind of scouted it out. And he knows exactly where he wants it and what he's interested in, which as I was going through and studying, some of the commentators, they said, because he was traveling around and he knew the area, not only was that the case, but it also says in, chapter 13, verse 18, that's where he was back. And we'll read that actually. Chapter 13, verse 18, then Abraham moved his tent and went and dwelt by the terebinth trees of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and built an altar there to the Lord. So Abraham is familiar with this place. He kind of, must have been a beautiful landscape. He already had his decision made. And he's kind of going back to where he met God before, right? Where that altar was built. And I think that's kind of interesting because he's still showing respect to the Lord in a certain way. He's showing respect to Sarah. And he goes back to where he was before. And then Ephron here answers him and says, it's a field, it's the cave. You can have the field in your cave. I'll give it to you. He says that 3 times there in verse 11. I give it. So he's saying, bury your dead. You can have this land. We already discussed this here. And then verse 12, it goes on, and Abraham bowed himself down before the people of the land. So that goes right back to, he's still showing respect. He's still being humble. And he spoke to Ephron in the hearing of the people of the land, saying, if you will give it, please hear me. I will give you money for the fields. Take it from me, and I will bury my dead there. So this is actually one of those verses here that everyone kind of has a little different take on it, right? So Ephron already says you can have it, and at face value, that's kind of showing respect to Abraham as well. But then Abraham comes back and says, if you'll just give me a price, I'll pay for it. I don't want to just take it from you. And at first I thought, that's kind of cool. Some of the commentators, I think it's David Guzik, I went through and listened to his, and he came out and said at the time, kind of the culture, the way they do business, right? Abraham was a businessman of sorts. He was out there doing God's work, if you will. And kind of the culture on negotiation or whatever at the time was, they kind of start out with like this idea of I'll give it to you, and then they'll go do this massive price, right? We read that here in verse 15. It says, "And Ephron answered Abraham, saying to him, My Lord, listen to me. The land is worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that between you and me? So bury your dead." So Ephron says you can have it. Abraham says, thanks, but I want to pay for it, right? And so I think that's interesting because not only is it, I guess a form of respect, he's gained permission through all these people, and he's still being honorable, right? He wants to hold up to his end of the deal. He's like, we're both blessed in more ways than we can imagine here. I want to pay you. And Ephraim goes, listen, my Lord, it's only 400 shekels of silver. What is that between you and me? So this is another example of showing that God's blessed Abraham his whole life. If 400 shekels is nothing, then that's interesting. But I guess the form of negotiation is after you get together and you decide what you want, they'll throw out this like absurd amount of money for whatever the area of the land it was, right? And the idea was once that huge absorbent amount is out there, then you kind of start talking them down and get to the point that they actually want. So for instance, if it was only worth 100 shekels, he'd be like, I want 400 shekels. That's what the land's worth. Well, everybody knows it's not worth 400 shekels. But then from that point, you can start negotiating, right? But it's interesting because it says, what is it between me and you? So bury your dead. So they're going back, just bury her. And verse 16, Abraham listens to Ephron, and Abraham weighed out the silver for Ephron, which he had named in the hearing of the sons of Heth, 400 shekels of silver, currency of the merchants. So this is an official currency. This is the silver. He hears the number, and he gives it to him. So that was two different points of view I've seen at first. It's like, okay, well, if it's only 400 shekels, it's nothing between us. But then after understanding that's kind of the way they negotiated, and that would have been a large amount of money for what this parcel of land was, that shows another side of the story, right? And from the Google search I did, it says that 1 shekel of silver was about a month's wages for a common laborer. In the back of my Bible, it said that 1 shekel of silver is about $128. So this parcel of land he's buying is about $51,200 at the printing of the currency when this Bible is printed. So that's still a lot of money, right? And it goes into, they give him the cave, the land. He gives him the shekels of silver. Verse 17, so the field of Ephron, which was in the Machpelah, which was before Mamre, the field and the cave which was in it, and all the trees that were in the field, which were within all the surrounding borders, were deeded to Abraham as a possession in the presence of the sons of Heth, before all who went in the gate of the city. I think that's interesting because, like I mentioned earlier, at this point, Abraham has heard that, all this land is going to be you and your descendants, but this is the first time he's getting an actual piece of paper saying this is your land. And it's interesting because, at any point he could have bought up as much land as he wanted, but he waits and then he buys a parcel of land for his family's burial site, right? And I think that's interesting. But one other thing I found interesting is this whole process is done with witnesses. This isn't just Ephron and Abraham coming together and talking it out. And that's important, especially culturally, because as you're going through the Bible, it says, 2 or 3 witnesses, let a thing be established. When you translate that over to the New Testament, they were trying to find enough people to make a story similar enough to convict Jesus as well. So having witnesses when you're doing business deals, contracts, or whatever, then it goes back all the way. And so in front of all these guys, they're sitting there going, whoa, you just gave Ephron all this money up front. You didn't bargain him down. This is kind of a show of sorts, right? Not necessarily in a bad way, but Abraham wants this land. He buys it. They give the deeds to him. And it goes through with, it's not just the cave that he bought, it's the whole field, all the trees that go along with it. This whole process is, Abraham showing humility, respect. He's being courteous, right? He's not, taking advantage of them or trying to scam them in any way. So when we're going through our lives, that's important to keep in mind as well, right? If we're doing business with somebody, not only is it wise to have witnesses there for protection on both sides, but you should also be respectful and courteous in both ways, because respect kind of goes both ways, and you want to make sure that you're We're going through there. Verse 19, and after this Abraham buried Sarah, his wife, in the cave of the field of Machpelah, before Mamre, that is in Hebron, in the land of Canaan. So the field of the cave that is in it were deeded to Abraham by the sons of Heth, and the property for a burial place. So this is, at face value, it's very simple, right? But the application to us is you can show the humility, you can show respect, and you can show courtesy all the way through it. But another thing that's interesting is, as simple as this chapter seems, this lays the story out for the rest of Genesis, right? Not only is Sarah buried there, Abraham's buried there, Isaac and Rebekah are both buried there, Leah and Jacob are buried there. These are all confirmed accounts as you read Genesis. So this family burial site, that's where they all went, right? And yeah, it's interesting. One thing that I was going through, one name that was missing there with that family is Rachel. I'm pretty sure it was Rachel. She was not mentioned there. So if anybody has any idea on why she wasn't mentioned being buried there, throw that one out there. And if anyone has any other things to throw to it.
Yeah, she was buried another way.
Was she? Okay.
It was kind of funny. He loved Rachel, but at the end of the day, he was buried with Leah.
Mm-hmm. I think that's interesting.
And it says that he loved. It's interesting how the scripture points out that he loved Leah.
Yeah. Uh-huh. No, I thought that was interesting as I was doing the research, as everybody else was mentioned except for her, and I knew there was a little bit of the story, but I couldn't recall for sure. But one thing I found interesting is, no, I could not find anyone doing a standalone teaching on this chapter. Everyone's throwing it in with 22 or with 24, and I think that's probably just because, like I said, face value, it's just, recording it. But yeah. Anybody else have anything to throw in there? Dean? Pastor Dean, let's hear it.
Well, I did, but now I'm going to. No, it just honestly, it reminds me of, was it David when he bought the land, and he said, the guy goes, well, let me just give it to you, and he said, his response was, I refuse to give to the Lord what doesn't cost me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, obviously Sarah's not the Lord, but being where we're at in Ephesians coming up, we're going to be talking about husbands and wives, right? And I see in the way Abraham loves Sarah, and he wasn't willing to just settle for a free piece of land for her burial site. He wanted it to cost him something. He didn't care what the cost was. And again, tie that together with how the Lord loves us, and that's the way Christ looks at us. He doesn't matter what the cost is. It doesn't matter what that end number is. He wasn't afraid to pay it, and he would have paid anything, and he did pay everything.